Welcome to everybody. Welcome here in Siena for the H-Tune workshop. I say just a few words to say that I'm very happy that we arrived at the 7th edition of our economic history Tuscan University Network workshop. Our network is really something quite rather light. We try to link various economic historians in Tuscany with the University of Firenze, with Renato, University of Pisa, Giovanni, University of Pisa, Sant'Anna, Alessandro, and here in Siena. Our main aim is not to constitute a center or something like that, but just to organize seminars, workshops, and other events in economic history. We have a special aim to promote the research of young people. We have some young scholars amongst us today, and we are properly the quantitative approach, although we are not exclusive in this. In our network there is a stable presence of other colleagues around Italy, Giovanni, Lele, Andrea, and so on. And I'm happy that all of them are here today. And I would like to thank them, also our department, to support us in this initiative. And I see some colleagues of the departments here today. I say a few words on the tradition of our workshop is to present preliminary research with the idea to receive comments in informal discussion. You usually circulate papers, even if preliminary, in order to have a better discussion of our research. Usually there is no topic in our workshop, but this year we decided to have a workshop and a proper topic, living standard and new economic history, considering that with Alessandro and Giovanni we have a project since last year on this issue. And thus, in this special occasion, we have invited as a keynote speech one of the most important scholars in this field, Professor Robert Allen from NYU Abu Dhabi University, and where he's a global distinguished professor of economic history and social science. Bob, I must say, relaunched this field within economic history with a couple of really seminal papers in 2000 and 2001, in which he provides new tools to measure living standard in comparative perspective. And recently, really very recently, Bob published an article in American Economic Review 2017. Is a paper on absolute poverty in nowadays. And I have to say also that although Bob is worldwide well known for this kind of studies, which are the topic of our workshop today, is also well known for his studies on the Industrial Revolution. His very important book, The British Industrial Revolution in Global Perspective, Cambridge University Press, 2009. And for his studies on what he called the Soviet Industrial Revolution, with a very famous book, Farm to Factory, a reinterpretation of the Soviet Industrial Revolution, 2003, Princeton University Press. He is also popular amongst our undergraduate students because his book, Global Economic History, a very short introduction by OUP, is a textbook for our undergraduate student in economic history. And moreover, I think that his main argument in the Industrial Revolution is also part of our political economy course developed inside the core project, which is a strategic project for our department. And Bob is particularly glamour in this because there is a video where Bob explained the Industrial Revolution, and there is a lot of like on the website. And we belong to this network led by Sam Bolz, who was a professor here at the University of Siena, and Wendy Carroll. So we are really happy to have Bob amongst us. We are here in the room dedicated to Richard Goodwin, as said yesterday. All of these are from Richard. And I don't want to spend other time, and I leave the floor to Bob for his speech, applying the absolute poverty methodology to historical data. Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelangelo, for that excessively complimentary introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me here, and for all of you for attending. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a very beautiful city. I've never been to Siena before, and it's delightful. What I want to do today is, as Michelangelo said at the end of his remarks, is take this absolute poverty approach and try to apply it historically and see what it reveals and see what problems it throws up. I'm going to do this approach. I hope this is not too self-indulgent, but in order to see what the innovation is, as it were, you have to see what was there before. So I want to review in a kind of autobiographical way how I developed various approaches to living standards. And I think there's a sort of, I suppose, an underlying theme to this is that it's we're trying to become more scientific as we go along. That it starts off as a kind of self-construction project, a bricolage, and then becomes more systematic, we hope, as we go along. So I started actually collecting I decided in the 1980s that wage and price history could be was a subject for the computer age. Previously, there were quite a lot of price histories and wage histories for different places, different countries. They were in books. They were great, huge books, tremendous tables. You could sit down with one for one country, another for another, and try to compare the numbers. And it was very difficult because the weights and measures were all different and the currencies were different. And before long, it was very confusing and you never got anywhere. But once I got a personal computer and Lotus 123 in it, I realized you could put all this in spreadsheets and then you could standardize it all. And so I thought that would be good and an easy thing to do, right? But 10 or 15 years later, I finally produced a paper where I tried to compare real wages across countries in Europe. That was the Great Divergence paper. And so I proposed a kind of methodology for doing this, which was to compute what I called welfare ratios, which is the ratio of a family's annual income, ideally, right? This is all sort of stuck together, though, in practice, but family income divided by the cost of living for the family at a specified standard, which was going to be somehow comparable over time and across space. And I was working with daily wages. I mean, in many ways, this has been developed. Jakob is going to talk about other annual wages, other approaches to this, but I was working with daily wages and so had to estimate annual incomes from daily wages. I'm not going to develop that concept much today, but I want to focus on the other part, the cost of living, which was the number of people per family times the cost of a rent's basket for an average person. And the average is across everybody in society, men, women, adults, children. That's the idea. So we have to define that, and then we can plug it into this framework and try to compare living standards. And the idea is to define the reference basket. So,
and what do you use the average over all the members of the family, and don't use the equivalent scale? I mean,
I did start off actually using equivalents, and I decided in the end it was just simpler and more comparable with things like World Bank approaches to use the average over everybody. And that's what I did. So I tell you how I did that. And I mean, I think it could work. It works out the same way, but I think this is more general. So comparability was going to be guaranteed by specifying a calorie requirement. And I've gone through various levels of the calorie requirement. And then a consumption pattern corresponding to that is specified. And it's guided, initially, you see, this is all just sort of back of the envelope, guided by descriptions of what poor people consume. Because Giovanni Vecchi maybe is going to give us budgets for all of these people, but I didn't have budgets, so I just made up budgets based on descriptions. So the first budget was what I called the respectability basket, and it was inspired by budgets of the respectable poor, so-called, in England and the Low Countries. And then the basket was modified in detail to apply to other parts of Europe. And so the sort of, this is an example, just to, a description from Sir Frederick Eden's book, The State of the Poor, of the Ealing Gardener in 1790s. And it was a family with, say, a man was 40, he had a wife, and he had 4 children. And he seemed fairly typical. When you read these books, you see this is much more systematic than most of them, but it's not complete either in the same token. But you find what his income is, the sort of things they consume, bread, the quantities are given here. This is very helpful. Beer, meat, cheese, and then you go on and we get some other things they consume, and also things down to, for instance, coal. That's their source of heating. And the number of 5 million BTUs that I'm going to use later is actually the equivalent of the amount of coal that the Ealing Gardeners consumes, right? This is where the number came from. So based on that, I concocted this respectability basket. And there's 3 parts to this, and these 3 parts are going to carry on through what I'm talking about to more recent work. There's the food part, and that's what I said, that's going to be the food. There's non-food stuff, which is like clothing, fuel, and lighting, and then there's rent for accommodation. And this particular budget will give, unless I'm mistaken, confusing them, 2,100 calories per person per day, which is what I thought was which we can arrive at that number with by various means, but that seems like a plausible average for calorie consumption. Now, the thing about that was I applied this to laborers in Europe, and then in other work with other people to India and to China, and constructed this graph of living standards compared to one. So one, if it would work out that the number is 1, that means that the laborer's annual income equals the cost of keeping 4 people at that standard specified in the respectability budget. So that's the subsistence wage in this sense. So higher numbers mean they're above subsistence, lower numbers below. But the thing that's discomforting about this graph is that you have people down here at like 0.3 and 0.4. So they can only earn it, the man only earns enough money to buy 30% of the cost of the basket. So what's happening? And it may be that women and children are earning money, but they're not paid very much. So that's not going to make up the difference. And so obviously they're going to have to cut back on spending. And this led to defining a subsistence basket, which was more Spartan and had less expensive items in it. Just as a kind of story, I remember about the time I was working on the respectability basket, a colleague of mine, I was at the University of British Columbia then, an Indian development economist, who always asked me these broad, naive questions, hailed me down the corridor and said, Bob, what did the classical economists mean by the subsistence wage? And so I said, I can show you. So I showed him the respectability basket and said, this was what an English laborer made, that's subsistence. And he looked at this and he said, these people aren't poor. He said, look at that beer they're drinking. Look at all that cheese, all that meat. He said, these people aren't poor. These people are very rich. And I thought he just didn't know what he was talking about. But the truth is, I didn't know what I was talking about. And he was right. And so when you, if you say, so I stripped out, like meat is a very expensive source of calories, as is cheese and beer, so forth. We strip out these things, we tried to come up with a basket that had 2,100 calories, but cheaper. Also reduced the non-food stuff. So this was the subsistence basket, and this basket has the virtue that basically laborers can actually buy it. So this was a happy consequence. I didn't, in fact, set it up exactly like that, but it came out that way. So you see here that if the index is 1, a laborer's salary, as I computed it, can buy the basket, and except for the early 19th century where it's a bit lower, so that's not a good time for workers anywhere. I mean, it was kind of above that. So this was reassuring.
Excuse me, why
Sorry?
just for daily and Beijing about coal consumption? It's hot there.
I didn't do that then. I do this today. You see.
Excuse me, another question about rents. Rents are computed as 5% of all the basket anyway.
Yeah. So this is also bad.
I mean, if you live in London, it's the same as if you live in.
It depends 5% of whatever the basket costs. Yeah. So this reason for this was because this all started by computerizing these price histories, and generally they don't have any information about rents. So I've been working on this project for 12 or 13 years, and I was desperate for a result. So I said, I'm just going to assume it's 5%. And 5% is, if we look back at the Ealing Gardner's budget, his rent, I think, was like 8% of his income. So it seemed, if it's not a big number, it doesn't matter so much, right? And so I just did it. So this is a weak point, right? And we want to address this.
Yeah, but nowadays it's a big number.
Yeah, show you. Yeah, okay. These are some worries and thoughts at this point. So I was aware of the World Bank poverty line, and I thought, I wonder if it's ought to have some comparison with what I'm doing. And so it was in 2011, I got Eric Schneider, who was working for me, as to do online shopping in the United States. And he priced out all these various subsistence baskets with prices from Safeway stores in San Francisco and various other online retailers. And the wheat flour basket and rice baskets that I had cost about $1.25 a day. It worked out. So they were like in line with the World Bank poverty line. So that was really interesting and sounded good. But then also, so then I began thinking about the poverty line, and I looked at the original paper by Martin Ravalian and co. and tried to track down all the sources, because there are what they do to come up with $1 a day poverty. This is the paper that comes up with $1 a day. So they took a cross-sectional data set for the 1980s with poverty lines for about 35 countries. And they PPP'd them into US dollars. And then they had per capita consumption for the countries in US dollars, and they graphed them. And as the countries, and the sample went from really poor countries to really rich countries. As countries got richer, generally the poverty lines they had went up. But at the very bottom of the distribution, they were kind of flat. And they were all at about $1 a day, and that was the basis of the $1 a day poverty line. So I wondered what the budgets underlying this were, because each data point came from some budget study. So I tried to find all the budgets and see if they corresponded. And they turned out to be all over the place. I mean, I could only find half of them in published sources, and they clearly were not comparable with each other. And I couldn't find the other half, most of which came from World Bank sources. And I did ask Martin if he had copies of them, and he explained to me it wasn't worth his or the bank's time or trouble to answer my question. So that began our relationship. At any rate, since I've been Commission, then I did some work for Tony Atkinson and the Global Commission on Global Poverty, and he was interested in these subsistence baskets. And it was in the course of that another nagging thought came to the front of my mind because of a lunch conversation at Nuffield. And that was that these procedures were only taking account of calories, and obviously there's all sorts of other nutrients in what about them? And you could add nutrients to the whole discussion if you, in a linear programming framework, right? And of course, the first linear programming, this is a programmatic statement in my manifesto. We need a poverty line that has a clear meaning related to survival, health, and well-being, represents a constant standard across time and space, responds to local prices and circumstances, does not present intractable index number problems, and can be implemented with readily available information. So I'm claiming my procedures does all this, but anyway. So this is developed in this paper that Michelangelo referred to on absolute poverty when necessity displaces desire. And the food part, okay, this gets back to what I was saying before. The food, so there's going to be food, non-food stuff, and rent. All right, they're all going to be treated somewhat differently, but we're trying to answer these questions that have arisen about this. The non-food and the rent already, the fuel and the rent. The food part, the diet part, is dealt with through linear programming by trying to incorporate more nutritional requirements beyond calories into the procedure and see what the ramifications of that are. As was pointed out, the non-food part in the original procedure didn't take any kind of climate, and that seems peculiar. And every time I presented this work, and Angus Deaton has been there, he said, what about cold places and hot places? So anyway, we've tried something, but I have the feeling that this is still in the kind of bricolage stage of work. And then the rent component is clearly arbitrary and variable, and what we need to do something better than that. In some parts, I should say, in the historical literature, some people have written papers where they've found housing rent series for places, and they put them in, right? This has been recognized for some time, and some work's been done by other people, but we want to take this on board. So as I say, the dietary requirements, the historical baskets only took account of calories. I'm not going to go through this in detail. The numbers of the calories have been changed from time to time, but now, all right, we want to include more nutrients. So we want to do this as linear programming, so I'm going to review linear programming here just a bit. So the linear programming diet problem works like this, that we have a list of possible foods to go in the diet, and it can be unlimited in principle. And we have prices, we need prices for all these foods because we want to minimize the cost of the diet. So we're going to choose foods that both individual items and the quantities of the individual items to get a diet. And the cost of that diet we can calculate, and we want to make the choices so that we minimize the cost of the diet. Right? That's the objective function, but there's constraints, which are the nutritional requirements. So the diet has to be chosen to satisfy these requirements. And essentially, you can have we're going to we have a requirement for calories, protein, fat, then there's going to be varying numbers of vitamins and minerals. And each of these is represented in the problem with an inequality constraint. So you have to have nutritional information about diet, nutritional composition for all the potential foods that you're choosing from. And then you can calculate how many calories you get from a kilogram of bread and how much fat and how much protein and so forth. So you get this big matrix of requirements, and then you have to minimize the cost subject to all of those and meeting the totals, total of calories, total amount of protein and so forth that you specify. And there's another requirement, which is that all the quantities have to be at least 0. You can't have negative quantities. So we're minimizing, this cost up here, that linear function, subject to this matrix, all of these inequality constraints. And if you contrast that with the dual formulation of the standard consumer problem, you're minimizing, in that case, the cost in the same way, but you have a single utility constraint. You want to minimize the cost of the diet so that the utilities are greater than some specified level. So the difference is here we have these requirements for nutrients in the linear programming case, whereas in the standard consumer case you have this utility requirement. So this is the sense in which the subtitle of my paper is Necessity Replaces Desire. Desire is what's in the standard problem, and that's that constraint. necessity is all these nutritional requirements and the linear programming constraint. And in fact, if I'm in an extremist mood, I say that what it means to be poor is that your life is governed by linear programming, not by standard consumer theory. Like you're on the margin, you're trying to survive, so you need to meet these requirements. It may not be quite so black and white, but I think that this bites and this matters. So George Stigler, of course, was the first person to formulate this problem in 1945. And he didn't have the simplex algorithm, let alone solver in Excel to implement the simplex algorithm. But he reasoned his way to almost the right solution. And it's interesting, our comparison with what I get.
Yes.
Which is,
Spanish.
yeah, he gets all this wheat flour, dried beans, milk, cabbage, and spinach. And his reaction to this is that nobody lives like this. This is absurd, right? And there's been lots of work on trying to bring in taste in various ways. But I think this is certainly true for us. We don't live like this. But I don't think this is so true for people in poor countries whose diets in many respects are much more like this. I mean, this doesn't look a million miles away from the subsistence basket, right? So what nutritional requirements to use? This is not an exact science. We need, some micronutrients don't separate the rich from the poor. We want requirements that actually separate the rich from the poor. So like iodine, if you live near an oyster bed, you have enough iodine. If you don't, you're iodine deficient. So that doesn't really tell you anything about your wealth. So I don't use iodine. We won't go through these in detail, but there's a lot of stuff that I disregard for that reason. And then there's, the nutritionists. I've read a lot of nutritional literature, and they're very keen to say that everything they're dealing with is essential. So they'll come up with 25 requirements and different nutrients, and they're all essential. But that's not really helpful. So part of the trick, I think, in this is trying to figure out some way to get through all of that approach of the nutritionist and try to isolate things that are more essential and distinguish them from ones that are less essential. So the way I finally did it was to begin with the most obvious constraint, which is calories, and then add on other constraints and see how the solution changed. And then eventually you can add on so many constraints that the solutions become completely unreasonable. So in fact, at the ends of the distribution, they're all unreasonable. So something in the middle is what I think is in play in practice. So this paper works on two levels, right? There's works on the normative plane. When we're setting a poverty line, we're making a moral judgment. But it also is trying to work on the positive plane, the empirical plane, because we'd like the model to replicate as closely as possible what poor people actually do, or what people on the poverty line actually do. So we start with a 1,700 calorie model. This is the lowest calorie level I think is really at all defensible for a society-wide average. So this is the most Spartan thing. Then what we're going to do is go with calories, protein, and fat, the macronutrients. And I raise the calorie requirement there, and we have protein at 50 grams per day. Calories and protein, there's actually a scientific basis, objective basis for getting at these numbers. With the other stuff, it all gets a little fuzzier. So fat's 55, which is what's in the literature as a minimum, but it's harder for me to see precisely why it should. Oh no, that's wrong. It should be 34. Sorry, I haven't updated my slide. It's 34. And then what I call the basic model is the CPF model plus the requirements for iron, thiamine, folate, niacin, and B6. It's the minerals and vitamins to prevent anemia, pellagra, beriberi, and scurvy. Vitamin C should be in there too. And then the full course model is all of those plus a whole bunch of other stuff that I found in nutritional literature. So what happens when you do this? So I run these models. So I did this with data from the International Comparison Project 2011 price data for all the countries in the world. This is the data that's the basis for PPP exchange rates, right? And I got access to use the data. So there's a very nice Excel table that's like lists 160 countries or so in the world as columns, and then there's 1,100 items going down the table, which include several hundred foods, but also clothing, housing, the cost of changing a tire in your car, all sorts of particular service prices like this, all kinds of stuff. Anyhow, so I took this range of countries, which has some poor African countries up to, the UK, the USA, and France, and ran these models with different sets of constraints, and this is even a fifth constraint on it. So when you run it, so one of the features of linear programming is that the number of items chosen in the solution is less than or equal to the number of nutritional requirements you impose. So if you run the model with just the calorie requirement, that's one constraint. You can only have one item in the solution. So the 1700 one has only got one. The CPF's got 3, so it can have 2 or 3 items, right? So you get more variety in the diet by increasing the number of constraints. And by the time you get out here to the one which has got 12 or 15 requirements, we never get that many foods, but we get a lot more foods, right? Another thing that happens is as you increase the number of requirements, the weight of the diet, that you get more food items and more kilograms of food. You get more nutrients by getting either one. So basically both of them go up, right? And so this shows you how weights increase as you increase the requirements. Now this is interesting. We just what's going on here, because you see basically that here there's 2 numbers. There's 70, which recurs quite a number of times, and then there's something in the 170s. So what the solutions look like, the numbers that are in the 170s are some kind of grain or grain product. It's like wheat flour, it's like sorghum, millet, depends on where you are, but it's a basic carbohydrate, all right? So this is interesting though. 70, what's that? 70 is a glass of vegetable oil like that. If you have a glass of vegetable oil like that once a day for a year, you'll get your necessary calorie requirement. And of course you'll die, right? Because you don't get anything else but fat from the vegetable oil. So, I mean, one of the lessons of this is if you only have a calorie requirement, it's a recipe for death for most people in the world. So this is not, people don't do this. And so this is kind of not going to be describing behavior. But, yeah. So this, I think, is actually a feature of a product of the last 200 years of economic history. So I run this model, for instance, with data for Canton in 1704, and vegetable oil is more expensive than rice. So the solution comes out with rice for China in 1704, but today it won't. And so it's the spread of palm oil cultivation across Southeast Asia that's driven down the price of vegetable oil. So globalization has not just affected the diets of the rich, it affects the diets of the poor as well by changing these things. Okay, so what diet should we use to define the poverty line? So as I say, the 1,700 kilogram diet often leads to death, so that's not very good. The CPF diet is much better, but it leaves people with serious deficiencies. So one of the features of the CPF diet is it has no vitamin C requirement, and so there's no vegetables in the diet. So the CPF diet is if it's 2 foods, it's a grain product and oil, about 10 kilograms of oil. And if it's 3, it's rice, beans, and oil, basically. But you have no vegetables, so you have no vitamin C, and there's no animal product. And that means you have no vitamin B12, which means you're anemic. So these are not entirely satisfactory either. The full course diets that have everything, they require so many kilograms of food that they're actually way above average food consumption in many poor countries. So it's like nobody's actually, poor people aren't actually consuming them. It's too much food. So this leaves the kind of basic diet as the likely candidate for explaining behavior. So that's what I'm going to go with in the end. I'm sorry, I'm going over this sort of quickly, but there's more detail if you want to read the paper. So one of the things I tried to do was to test that more systematically. So I used, I would like to find the diets in the people, for all the people on the poverty line. That would be the really good test, but I can't find that information. So I took 1961 average consumption, which is from the FAO's food balance sheets, which is the earliest ones there were and covers all the countries. So how does that work out? And so if you start with the rich countries, you see George Stigler's point. So I've used broad categories here, but like the total weight of the diet is one thing we can compare to what people actually do. So for the rich countries, the linear programming solution implies 343 kilograms per year of food. In actual fact, people in the rich countries average 906 kilograms of food, so a lot more food, right? If you do this for the poor countries, the prediction's 293 and the actual is 334. So that's pretty close, right? So one of the things in favor of the basic model is it comes pretty close to predicting the actual total amount of food people consume. If you look at the various components like grains or bread, the predictions for the poor countries are 168 and the actual is 138. So again, it's not too far off. The oils and fats, it's 6 versus 4. The animal products, it's 28 versus 41. People consume somewhat more fruits, nuts, and vegetables than predicted. And then other, so there's nothing predicted for other by the model, and its average is 19 kilograms. So other is principally sugar. So sugar is, everybody consumes sugar, it seems, but it's never a least cost thing to do. It's always a ceremonial thing to do. And there's a few places where there's some alcohol consumed, but not very much. In contrast, in the rich countries, as I say, so this is Stigler's point, we consume lots more than the least cost diet. We consume much less grains and breads than is predicted by the LP model. We consume a little more fat. We consume way more animal products, way more vegetables and fruits, and way more other. So other in countries like the UK, the US, and France is principally sugar and alcohol. There's close to 100 kilograms a year of alcohol on average consumed in these countries. So that's how that worked out. So it seemed to me in general the linear programming basic diet is pretty good at predicting the total weight of the food consumption in poor countries. Its composition across broad categories. Mostly it's grain-based and largely vegetarian, not much alcohol, if any. That's the kind of features that are predicted. And usually it gets the predominant grain right. Like, so when I do this for Zimbabwe, it predicts maize. When I do it for Niger, it predicts sorghum or millet. When I do it for Algeria, it predicts wheat, right? So it hits the African countries pretty well. This may be because they may do better where there's bad transportation, because then you don't have integrated markets, and so the price structure reflects the local supply situation, and then the linear programming retrieves the local supply situation from the price structure. It doesn't work so well in India and China, but these are very big countries with very diverse regions which are not well integrated, and in fact the average product pattern for the whole country may be different from any of its regions, right? So I'm not sure. It would be better to take a regional approach for the big countries. As I say, well, it's a little bit too, what it gets wrong, it's a little bit too Spartan and misses out the other things and so forth. Doesn't get the variety of fruits and vegetables people actually consume. This may be because you have one price for each thing, in the country and in the ICP. And so you get no seasonal variations or anything like that. Another thing is I think a lot of vegetables sell at similar prices and have similar nutritional composition. So you can vary the diet a lot without affecting its cost very much. Yes.
But in Asia, then there has always been a tradition of rice, and so grain is not so important. And I remember some work by Cavalli Sforza saying that his explanation of why we became whiter than the people in Asia is that in Asia, in rice, there was some vitamin D, and there was not in grain. And so there was a gene and cultural type of evolution. And so rice was also providing some vitamins that were not existing in grain. And this has also largely to do with geography, because in those countries, you know, there are more or less, both in India and China, a lot of rivers and places where you can easily cultivate rice. So rice had a big impact also in terms of their culture, the irrigation system, more centralized system, and so on. So perhaps what works for corn cultures does not work for rice cultures.
Well, it works so, the model does predict rice in like Southeast Asia. So smaller countries that are more homogeneous, it does a pretty good job of. It's just these really big, the two that are the biggest problems are just the biggest countries. If you look at the data, so India is, there's a lot of regional price data for farm products, state by state, and if you examine that, it just looks very unintegrated. And the rice growing regions, rice is really cheap. The wheat growing regions in the north, wheat is really cheap. So I don't know, I'm inclined to that. But I'll look at Cavalli Sforza on this further. I don't know that. All right, so let me go on to, so that was sort of the diet part. So non-food goods. So this question has come up, like what about fuel and what about accommodation? But we've been like with fuel. So one place one thing to notice is that the Millennium Development Goals define energy poverty as having essentially fuel less than 2 million BTUs and lighting less than 0.4 million BTUs. And this turns out to be, these requirements are based on engineering studies, like how much energy it takes to cook your food. There's nothing for heating in any of this, so they're kind of tropical type numbers. But they also turn out to correspond to the subsistence basket requirements. That they're not very different from those, which is perhaps interesting. But that doesn't answer the question, how does this stuff depend on climate? So like the World Bank, I decided I would use some expenditure surveys to try to get at this. But the surveys, I decided I wanted people that were indubitably poor, and also I wanted opposite ends of the climate distribution. So I found Prokopovich's survey of factory workers in St. Petersburg in 1907, and Shiraz's survey for the Bombay Commissioner of Labor of Bombay cotton workers in 1921. And these have quite detailed descriptions of spending by most helpfully, not completely, but usually by income bands. So what I decided was that I would take the lowest category of workers with a significant number of people. So like for St. Petersburg, I didn't use the one with only 3. I went up to the one with 11. So I was going to say that's going to be my poor workers in St. Petersburg. And then there's a corresponding table for Bombay, and you could equate spending. The Bombay survey is really good because it gives quantities and prices of everything, and it breaks everything down by all the income bands. The St. Petersburg one doesn't break everything down by income bands, and I had to use some extraneous prices. But the categorization is the same. So we've got clothing, footwear, and bedding, for instance, and there's 3 lines for those in the total. And what I did with these is I used the price of coarse cotton cloth in the 2 places as the deflator to convert them into the expenditure into quantities of cloth equivalents. So this is a little bricolage kind of statistics. But it's interesting because, so we can look at the lowest wage category, compare those, or the average across all the workers. And people use a lot more clothing, footwear, and bedding in St. Petersburg where it's cold than they do in Bombay, right? The footwear is like 25 times greater. I mean, most of the people in Bombay going around without shoes, but you can't do that in St. Petersburg, and that shows up in these figures. Clothing is also considerably more, and the total is, you know, even for the lowest paid workers, is like 2.5 times more of this stuff where it's cold than hot. And fuel and lighting. So fuel, they don't break this down in St. Petersburg by income level bands, but the average is, you know, 24.62 million BTUs versus 3.5 in Bombay for the average worker. So 3.5 is kind of a number like the subsistence baskets I've been using, whereas 24.62 is a lot more, but then it makes sense that you'd need a lot more fuel in St. Petersburg than you would in Bombay. And lighting is also a bit higher there. So we can corroborate these figures with engineering calculations. So there's heating industry websites that tell you how to do this. So basically, what I'm going to say is that there's going to be 4 people in a family, and a family lives in one room. I'll explain why I have one room later. And so it's a room that's 3 meters by 4 meters. It's 2.4 meters high. Each person's going to have 3 square meters of space. And we want to maintain, just hold on. We want to maintain the internal, you have to specify the internal temperature you want to maintain the dwelling at. So that's going to be 59 degrees Fahrenheit. This is all actually done in English units, so that's why it's 59. And then you have to know what the external temperature is. And then you can and you have to know the efficiency of the construction in terms of insulating qualities. And then you can calculate how much energy you need to satisfy this problem. So you can get external temperatures as heating degree days from I'll get to that. Whoops. What am I doing? I don't want the conclusions. How did I get up here? See, we have a lot more to do. I hope I'm going to get through this. Anyway. So this is I did read about heating requirements. There's a great blog literature on how much it costs to heat your log cabin in Alaska and stuff like this. And so a badly constructed, poorly insulated, drafty building like this will have an R value of 2, they say. And you can find degree days of heat from this energy website, which covers all weather stations.
Yeah, the website for everything.
Yeah, you know, all weather stations and airports in the world, and you can get you tell the internal temperature you want, and it knows the temperature history at half-hour intervals for a long time, right? And it'll tell you degree days. And so when you do this, it turns out like places in the tropics have 0 degree days. You don't have to heat in Bombay. St. Petersburg, you need 6,315. And what I did with all these other cities come out as I indicated. And so what I ended up doing to draw this together is I took St. Petersburg and Bombay at the extremes, and to figure out how much clothing or fuel you needed at intermediate places, I proportioned it in terms of the degree days of heat required by this calculation, right? So that I can now calculate how much fuel, how much lighting, how much clothing you need anywhere from this stuff. And so, and then where the degree days of heat was 0, I used the Millennium Development Goals, because that's the requirement you need for cooking. So everybody has to cook. Anyhow, all right, so that's what I did for that. So I've tried to address these questions that way. I'll show you how this plays out in a minute. Housing, I set the requirement, so I set an explicit requirement. I said people need 3 square meters per person. That's the minimum requirement, which is not a lot of space, right? So that's why 4 people can live in a room 3 by 4 meters. This is less space than in so-called overcrowded accommodation in rich countries today. So New York City, overcrowding, which means maybe 5 to 10 square meters. So they have more space. Overcrowded people in New York have more space. But there's many examples of poor people, places in poor countries, where you get a number like 3. And so these are some examples. So I'm working with 3. So this means to do the calculation, we have to know what the rent per square meter is. And so I did this initially for 2011. So the ICP has some patchy information about rents. So 6 of the countries I'm dealing with, I could get rents from the ICP, and I could choose traditional so-called traditional housing with minimal sanitary facilities. So for others, I had to develop rent information from other sources. So I took large cities or the capital city, and this is, for instance, what I did. So France, I said Paris. So I wanted to get the poorest arrondissement in Paris. So that's these Nervian there. Okay, this was a map also online of poverty in Paris. All right, then I found this website which tells me rents. So within the 19th arrondissement, this dark blue is the cheapest district. So I chose that district, and it says the mean rent is 18.68 euros per square meter. So that's my number. So I did this for other countries. So this is in New York. The Museum of Modern Art in New York has a big exhibition about globalization and slums. And so they have these pictures of accommodation, of how illegally subdivided apartments in New York that are selling really cheap accommodation. And this works out. You can't read this well, I'm afraid, but it tells you how many people there are and how much space they have and what the rent is. And this turns out to imply a rent per square meter that's quite similar to the fair market rent that the U.S. Department of Housing uses for its subsidy programs. So I use that. That's Mumbai. That has a square, this is from a Guardian report on this big slum in Mumbai, and it gives a rent of 3.5 rupees per square foot, which we can then turn into that. And this is an account of Monrovia, which talks about rents rents per room, which I then convert to square meters there. So, okay, so what is this? You take all these numbers and you put them together and you put them in US dollars at the exchange rate, and you get remarkable differences in rent. So the poor countries are all sort of between 50 cents and $1 per square meter per month as rents. And you go up to the rich countries. Well, Lithuania is here. My RA on this was a Lithuanian, so Lithuania is in the sample. But it's weird. But the other places, the UK, so that's using London, the USA is using New York, and France is using Paris. They're all up there at sort of $20 or $25 per square meter per month. So this is way, way higher. This is right. So, okay, if we put all this together, add up food, non-food, and rent, this shows you what the spending patterns are. So the poor countries are all spending about 2/3 of their income on food, and somewhere generally between 5 and 10% of their income on rent. So this is actually like the assumption I was making for these historical baskets. So that's kind of materializes here for poor countries today. But rich countries, like people would be spending much less on food, and over half of their spending at the poverty line would be on rent. Right, so I mean that's quite different. So this is to say that, and if you figure this out, if you calculate out what the poverty lines are, you find that for 2011, with the basic diets, poverty lines in Africa are actually around, the official poverty line is $1.90 a day in 2011. A lot of the African countries are like that. I get considerably higher lines for South Asia and East Asia. And rich countries all have higher lines. So the developing countries average $2.61 and the rich countries $3.59. So it's impossible to live on the World Bank poverty line in a rich country in a big city. So this is why people sleep on the street. Yeah.
Super quick question, because that might apply to urban areas, right? When we know that.
So this is especially true in the rich countries, because these have come from big cities, right? You can live in a shack in the mountains in Washington State for practically nothing. So in in the rural areas, you can live on something that's more like the World Bank line in a rich country. So it's not such a big problem though in the poor countries because the rent's not such a big fraction of their spending, right? So it was like 5% or 8%. So it's not such a sensitive issue, I think, it seems to me. Okay, I'm going on too long here. So how does this affect this new, what I really wanted to do was talk about how this new method affects measurement in the past and which of these things turn out to be important and non-important. So we need to push this backward. So I'm investigating this for Manchester, Boston, Moscow, Bombay, and Cairo. Cairo's going to drop out of here because I haven't had time to do Cairo. But we need early samples of lots of prices of lots of foods to do the linear programming to see if the baskets stay the same or change. So you can't, for that to be at all meaningful, you need a lot of prices, right? And this limits the possibilities. And we need more information historically on rents. Okay. And it turns out, just to tell you what the conclusion is, that the diet stuff doesn't have a lot of implications for real wage measurement. It turns out the various diets we come up with tend to cost similar amounts. But the non-food stuff has a big impact compared to what was before. So I wanted to come up with, these are sources for lots of large sets of prices for these countries at various dates in the past. And I do linear programmings on these. And so the way it works out so these are the kinds of lists of commodities that you can get a lot of prices for. So that the USA in 1890, there's a big national commission, the Aldrich Commission, which collects a lot of retail price data for all over. And so you get this, that set of prices. So there's lots of different kinds of meats and so forth. There's also, things that are important are they have various fresh vegetables and dried fruits. And this is canned foods have been introduced. So, if you look at there's monthly data on food prices in 1890, and it shows tremendous seasonality. So in the summer, you get lots of foods available, and they're just not available in the winter. So canned vegetables is something that's important for making vitamin C rich foods common a lot. And so there's Russia there too. Anyway, if you do this sort of thing, these are how the results come out. So my 2011 linear programming basket for the US had wheat flour as the main source of calories, vegetable oil, milk as the main source of protein, and B12, and cabbage as the main vegetable. And that's a sort of common result for some rich countries. If we go back to 1905 and run it again, we get wheat flour and maize flour as the two sources of carbohydrates. There's beef and potatoes. Potatoes comes through as an important way as a major source of vitamin C in many places. And then there's butter. And these are two subsistence baskets that I made up, which I put beans in. Beans rarely actually come out in these LP solutions. But you see, you can either do it with wheat flour or maize flour and some butter. So there's some changes, but not too dramatic. One of the reasons that the grains change is that their relative prices change. So this shows you price per kilogram of wheat flour and cornmeal in Boston. And from the 18th century up until the end of the 19th, wheat flour is much more expensive, right? And so a lot of the diet is on maize flour, and that's the least cost diet. But then here the prices equalize in the early 20th century, and by the time you get to the 1930s, wheat flour is going less than maize flour. So this is another big change in the history of the world, this fall in the price of wheat flour, which impacts on lots of these least cost choices. If we do this for the UK, the solution for 2011 was quite similar to the US, with mostly wheat flour and then milk and oil and cabbage again. Whereas if you do it for 1780, you don't have wheat flour, you have oatmeal and barley as the sources of carbohydrates. There's a little bit of beans, potatoes is in there, and then some beef and some lard.
Why you have two? You should have the minimum, the one with the minimum price, or they give different nutrients.
Sorry?
Why you have both oatmeal and barley? You should have only one carbohydrate, or not?
Because there's all these other nutrients.
Okay, so they are
And that's-
different in that sense. So it's
But it's actually, yeah. And so the various subsistence baskets are shown over here for comparison. And again, this sort of shift in the diet, the least programming solutions reflect changes in prices. So in England, wheat flour is much more expensive than oatmeal before the 19th century. So that's what's picked up by that solution for 1780. In the Industrial Revolution, they're similar, and then by the late 19th century, wheat flour is again falling way below oatmeal. So that's when it shifts, these cost diets shift. So the point of this is, I think you actually have to have different diets for different phases of history, right? I won't go through all these. I've done all this too much. So, okay. So let me just go on to, so what are the cost implications of this? So this shows the costs of the various diets over time in these countries. And what's remarkable is that mostly they're the same. So
just a clarification. So you have done the price year by year and the programming year by year?
No.
So
No.
just to understand
It's
it.
different.
So what I did here was
The cost of the different baskets.
I've got a subsistence basket with bread. This is from Moscow. So this is rye bread, and one with rye flour. And then this is a linear programming solution that has rye flour in it. Well, they have rye flour in it. And so they're quite similar, right? And this does Bombay, there's two different linear programming solutions for these years because there's two sets of prices. And then I had made up previously a subsistence basket with sorghum and rice. And they go, it's not very different. The biggest difference is in Boston where the maize basket, so the linear programming solution is there in the middle. If it was only a wheat basket, it's more expensive. The maize basket is less, but by the time you get to the 1890s, when the prices of maize flour and cornmeal and wheat flour have converged, the cost of the baskets have converged.
Excuse me, can you clarify, do you think that all families would buy the flour itself and then prepare it somewhere? I mean, they usually would buy bread, so it's the bread.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm worrying about. It turns out that in the US they actually buy flour and not much bread. And if you look at the prices, commercial bread is much more expensive than the flour. In England, the difference is not so great and they buy much more bread. But one of the things that concerns me in this, is increasingly concerned, is the degree to which you have to prepare the food. And is this reflected in the problem, right? So the nutritional, you can get a solution to one of these programs that has like wheat flour and beef. So, but both of those have to be cooked into something, right? Whereas if you come out with bread and cheese, you just make a sandwich. And to some degree, like I've taken account of this. So in most cases, like I don't have raw grains. Like the grain has been processed, at least into flour. And I had to, like with Indian data, like there's a commercial market for grinding charges, right? And I could add grinding charges to grain prices. But then some places people eat the grains, right? Like they boil the grains. Rice is a boiled grain. Or you can boil up barley or oats. So it's a bit tricky. And I'm not...
Is that related to the cost of cooking?
Yeah, it ought to be.
Grinding in the case of Italy matters.
Sorry?
Grinding, the price of grinding matters, is not negligible.
Yeah.
So that might
All right.
worth checking.
So I mean, I have this is an open list, we're becoming more scientific over time, but we're not completely scientific, and these are open issues. And the trouble is, so as you become more explicit about all these assumptions about nutrition and all this, then suddenly you have to start thinking about this whole new set of problems that, So let me say that if we look at non-food costs, they have a much bigger impact than the food stuff on any comparisons. So, for instance, if I calculated that for Moscow, the non-food costs with the quantities in the subsistence basket, it comes out at like that, very low. If you take the new baskets, it's very much higher, right? That's because there's all this extra fuel that people have to buy and all this extra clothing that they have to buy, right? And so the differentials are biggest in cold places. So there are differentials here, and the differentials here arise from the fact that the factory workers in the Bombay survey consume more cloth than the subsistence basket assumed. The fuel is about the same, so that raises the cost there, but not by remotely as much as it's raised in Moscow. In Boston, it's raised a bit more because it's colder, but not as much as in Boston, as in Moscow. In England, I run this back to 1760, and here the difference gets quite large, and this is another issue that has just come to the fore as I've been making these graphs, which is that if you go back to 1760, that's before the mechanization of textile production, and the price of cloth is very high, right? So I'm using this requirement that reflects the price structure basically of the early 20th century where cloth is really cheap, and even these poor workers use a lot of it. Whereas if you go back here, I think it's unreasonable. I don't think that people consumed remotely that much cloth. So I was hoping this was going to be a procedure that applied without any variation to all times and places, that it doesn't, it breaks down in the pre-industrial economies. And I don't have a solution to this yet, but that's a problem. So other things, so these differences are driven both by the quantities and their implications, but also by the prices. And so, I mean, it's interesting, like energy is really cheap in the US and the UK. It's considerably more expensive in St. Petersburg than it is there. And this is related to the fact that they import a lot of English coal. Russian coal is expensive everywhere. It's expensive in Moscow too. And then India has even higher fuel prices. There's a convergence here, and if you look carefully at the co-movements of the series, it's quite encouraging. But as you see, in the early 20th century, as shipping costs fall, these markets become more integrated, and you get the same cycle of prices in Alexandria as you do in St. Petersburg, because they're importing British coal into both of these places, and also in India.
Bob, sorry, I was looking at previous slide. I was a bit puzzled because I expected a bit more an impact of trade integration in this period. So an impact on the in the opposite way.
Yeah.
So declining prices.
Yeah. From
why
trade.
does it not happen?
Well,
it happens in England, of course, but not elsewhere. So you consider them to be not integrated?
No, the English graph goes back a lot further in time.
Okay.
I can show you some other. I have another graph here. This is cloth prices that go back to 1790 in all of these places, and you see here lots of similarity in integration in cloth.
So that's the impact.
Except for Russia, which has this incredible tariff, right, on cloth to protect their industry. But you go back here, and like this is Massachusetts prices, British prices, prices in India. They're very divergent, right? And they come into alignment. Yeah. So the 19th century is the time when globalization happened, right? The differentials by the early 20th century are all small. So whatever's happened because of the internet or container ships is trivial.
At one point, I mean, if you have sea transport or water transport are very low even at the beginning of the 19th century.
Yeah.
What really changed was the domestic transport via railways. But if you look at freights between New York and Liverpool were low also at the beginning of the 19th century.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Anyway, so we had to develop historical rent series. So what I did for this was to take, I could find things like this British report, which give rents in benchmark years and then rent indices for the various countries, the indices being of varying qualities, to run them back. So you get sort of discussions like this of working class dwellings in England versus the United States, and there's some discussion in the text. This all could be analyzed more, but you can see the impact of indoor plumbing on the rental rates, and there's some discussion there. Anyhow, that's the basic type source. And what's striking about it is that there's not a lot of difference when you take the rents for these various cities and convert them into US dollars. The difference between the high and the low is maybe 2 to 1. It's not 25 to 1 or 50 to 1 like it is now. So that's quite interesting. And so anyhow, if you use these rents compared to, so the red line here is what you get if you take 5% of the subsistence basket, and this is what you get if you use the 1913 rent for Moscow, and back with a rent index, it's considerably higher. In England, if you start off with rents from 1905 and run them back, it's like this to 1760. That's with Greg Clark's rent index and Wood's rent index and Greg Clark's index. This would be 5% of the subsistence basket. What's interesting, if you get back here to the 1770, this is what Arthur Young reports as the rent of a cottage converted into rent per square meter. So that's a rural rent, and that's actually right on with the 5% number. And his highest, most expensive city he visits is Kensington, which is not quite part of London at that point, but right next to it. And the rent there is right like that. So if you take these were basically urban rents in 1905 and run them back, you do hit these numbers. So I thought that was encouraging. Anyhow, so if you compute out shares for the cities, this is in the early 20th century, they work like this. And so what these look like are shares for poor countries today. Foods that, except for Moscow, which is weird because of the huge fuel cost, foods like 2/3, and rent is, here it's like 10 or 12%. So it's different from today, right? So 2011, rent in these rich countries was like 50% of the poverty spending. In 1905, it's like 10%, so it's much more normal. So something's happened in the 20th century. And anyway, so this shows you, I'll come to what happened in the 20th century momentarily. This shows you the differences in the total cost of these baskets compared to the subsistence basket. And like in places like Moscow, the new procedure gives a much more expensive basket than before, almost twice as much. And this is because of the rent, but also the clothing and the fuel, right? That has a big impact. In India, there's practically no effect, right? Because these things are much smaller. And England, it's a bit of an effect. In Boston, it's larger. And so this has an impact on welfare ratios, right? So Moscow, previously I was getting welfare ratios like 2, and now they're like 1. So I spent a long time thinking, how can Russia, which has got this very poor country with this incredible population growth, seems a lot like India, it should have like a Malthusian situation, and yet they've got a welfare ratio of 2. And so I had all these theories I worked out about how serfdom and the land commune restricted labor mobility and raised wages, and it's all wrong. Because when you take account of the climate, they needed to be paid so much in order they didn't freeze, right? Anyway, Bombay doesn't have nearly so much impact, and has some impact on England, but not as much as Moscow, which has a big impact. So the final point, I'm almost done here, is this difference in rents between like the early 20th century and today. So I think there's been a great divergence of rent. We've seen great divergences of GDP per capita, for instance, right, between the rich and the poor. So, but rents diverge, and it's in the 20th century sometime. And I'm just beginning to work on this a little bit. And I think that I've been reading old newspaper ads. And I think the big difference actually is from 1950 to about 2000. And because I ran some of these indices I've been talking about up to the Second World War, and there doesn't appear to be a big rent increase in the US or the UK in the interwar period. But if you look here, you can't actually make out all the numbers, I'm sure. But I looked in all the New York Times are online. And that's good because I lived in New York for a few years, so I actually know the neighborhood, so it makes it easier. So I took like 1959, these are places in Brooklyn that I was familiar with, and I wanted to compare them to 1999. So just here's a headline figure. So in 1959, this is a studio apartment is $105 a month. In 3-room apartments, $117 a month. You go over here to 1999, and it doesn't matter which you look at, they're all $1,700, $2,800 a month, right? Rents have gone up by 15 times in 40 years. And so this I think is a sort of general phenomenon, and I think this is an important feature of the modern world and the growth in inequality in recent times. And it shows up dramatically in these kind of figures. And I don't think any of these changes aren't due to gentrification, or they're not due to renovating apartments. I think if you standardize that, it'll do something, but it's not going to explain much. So this is another part. Anyway, so the conclusions are we can use these absolute poverty baskets as reference baskets in welfare calculations. The changes due to the linear programming diet have surprisingly little effect, which is discouraging. But the changes in the non-food and housing in the basket have substantial implications, especially in cold-rich countries. And there's some other questions that have come up. So one of the questions I didn't put down here is this question about the degree to which food is prepared, which I think is something that requires more thought. But in the pre-industrial world, where did people get their vitamin C? This is something I've been worrying about. So in most of these studies, you go back to the 19th and 18th centuries, and potatoes is the source of vitamin C, and it's a great source. But the potato is only introduced in Europe in the 17th century. So what happened before then? And people, I don't think, had scurvy. Right, because scurvy was discovered as a medical condition when long-distance ships in the Royal Navy, particularly in the 18th century. So I could think people were either growing their own vegetables, something like that, or depending on where you were foraging for vegetables. I did make up a model garden to append to the English model for 1780, so I could specify how many square feet of cabbages you grew, and kale, and English winter vegetables. And it turns out it doesn't take very much veg to solve these problems. So maybe that's what's going on. And also I'm worried about these cloth and fuel norms, because while they seem to make sense, some sense, for the early 20th century, by the time you get back to the middle of the 18th century, I just think they're too high, and this requires more thought. So that's it.
Thank you, Bob. We have questions. We have time to Fabio.
Yes. On the last thing you said, fuel, etc. I do think that your 59 Fahrenheit is too high. My idea is that poor people had gloves.
Yeah.
And that means much less than 59 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, it may be.
In Celsius it would be 15 degrees, 16 degrees. That's too high for poor people.
Yeah, it is 15 degrees.
It's 13.
But I have a more general question, which is the following. You're aiming at estimating a pure survival basket.
Yes.
But pure survival also requires being able to earn an income.
Yes.
Being able to earn an income also requires health expenditures and instruction expenditures. And you don't have those then?
No. I don't. I'm not sure. Partly this reflects my historical approach, in that I'm not sure there was much health expenditure that you could perform in the 18th century that did you any good. It is interesting on the educational stuff that if I went back and showed you the budget of the Ealing Gardner, there's a line in the budget for schooling for the children, right? And so it's not very much, but it is there. And I'm sure it will be more today than it was then.
Sorry, I was also aiming at the World Bank,
Yeah.
the $1 a day. If that leaves out the fact that you occasionally need medicines, that you must need to give some instruction to your children if they are going to earn a living, then the World Bank, it's all wrong. It's too low.
Well, okay. I think I didn't want to. I didn't do it. Okay, maybe it should be done. That means that the lines are all higher. Yeah.
Alessandro.
Yes, you are revising your own work, and I see the revisions. Okay, about the rents are interesting, so they are quite. But you come back, so I would like to ask you. So we have an established picture based on your own work from 1300, from the Middle Ages. Up to 1850, 1913, and is a picture that we teach to our students and so on. So do you think that, or your feeling is that if we include this correction for rent, since they might be different in different countries, we have to stop teaching that picture,
Well,
wait a bit, or it will be just a small adjustment of levels or something like that? What is, because
Well, I think that it'll reduce some of the differential between the North and the South, because there's got to be some more fuel in the North, right? But I don't think it's going to make it go away. But the actual answer is going to depend a lot on what you decide the pre-industrial values for these non-food things ought to be. And I think there have to be less than I've got, because such budget figures as I've looked at, people aren't buying that much fuel, and they're not buying that much clothing, so they're colder, right? And they just don't have as, especially, they don't have as much clothing, or they don't change their clothes as rapidly, right? So that's going to mean that this problem is alleviated.
okay. Yes.
Right? So, but being more systematic than that, I haven't. I was working on this in the plane coming down.
Okay.
Giovanni.
No, it was basically a follow-up on Mr. Ale's question, because the point is that you have two big points. One is that fuel account was much more expensive in northern countries, so this implies that the little divergence is smaller than. Second point about and second, that rents were much more important. And then I'm thinking when this started to be really important, because the point that rents are urban rents, and when most of the population were rural, probably rents were quite low. So probably this, because clearly you had, and so what I'm implying is that the increase in rents could have reduced the increase in welfare ratio towards, they say, when there is urbanization, meaning early 19th century England, late 19th century Italy, wherever. So basically the last upward part of your standard graph should be lower than
Well, as I said, the pre-industrial rural rents in England seem to come out the standard, the 5% procedure seemed to give the right level for the pre-industrial rural rents, right? It's only
when does it is no longer
when it's later than the 19th century, but the pre-industrial situation isn't any different there.
I also follow up on this. On rents, for example, in the pre-industrial world, we have for Florence an estimate by Lindert, who makes an hypothesis 8% of total income. But that will mean in Tuscany 10% in Florence and 6% in the countryside. We make this hypothesis. That will be higher than you, but also not so much higher,
right,
but a bit higher, but also differentiated by. However, you are estimating a subsistence level.
Yeah.
So you are making an hypothesis that at the level of subsistence, rent has a minor share.
Yeah.
This is what.
But so it's going to be less, presumably. Then. So if these are the orders of magnitude, then it's not going to change anything from what was done previously, in any broad sense.
John.
Thank you very much for this. I was wondering about this issue of clothes, and I was trying to think about actually family memories and clothes. So I read the paper, and I guess they are recorded in these budgets as in modern surveys as consumption goods. So there is the expenditure on them, but what they really were durable goods.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe and actually durable goods that most of the time were passed down generations. So maybe it's not really helpful, but maybe what we should do is to annualize to try to discount this expenditure over 30 years, 20 years, because people were just fixing clothes, adjusting to other sons in the family. Maybe that's a way to reconcile.
Yeah, I sort of played around with that, but I didn't get anywhere because it's not. I don't know what the stocks are, and But the point is, so another feature of this is like on the sort of the early survey data that I've seen, 18th century survey data. The only people that get new clothes are like the adults. Mostly the man gets new clothes and maybe the woman gets new clothes, but the children all get clothes that are made from worn out adult clothes. Right, and so this is also different from, and this bears on the schooling question. So I was reading I found a French dissertation on worker spending in Cairo in 1907, and the children there all got clothes. They went to school, and they had to have school uniforms. So some of their clothing, they were getting new clothing rather than this. So one of the ways that the clothing, the early 20th century clothing data may be expanded compared to pre-industrial is this kind of activity. Ugo.
You have been taking some data from big towns and for rent.
Yeah.
I have doubts about that because perhaps what makes sense for the subsistence basket is the marginal rent.
Yeah.
You want to get what was for Ricardo the marginal land, the one on which you're not getting differential rent. Because in fact, if you need to survive, you can go on the marginal rent. And also, I think this is more important because of course the variability in differential rent depends on many things. Some towns have become hubs of the world, and there are all sorts of things. They are fashionable and so. But this is not very important, I think, for.
But you didn't have the underground.
Huh?
You didn't have the underground to go to work, I guess.
Yeah. Well, today, so there's an interesting book about the really poor people in the U.S. by Matthew Desmond called Eviction, and it's all about how really poor people get evicted from apartments now when they can't pay their rent. And so there's lots of stories. He's a sociologist, and there's lots of stories about people, and basically the people that so it's interesting. So I did find these poverty lines for like the U.S. So this imply that almost 2% of the U.S. population lives below the international poverty line. And so mostly these people, I think, rarely pay the rent. And what they end up doing is crashing out on relatives until they're thrown out. So there's a lot of people that live like that. So they have to live in the cities because they need to work. So they're all trying to work, but they can't afford to pay rent. And so they live with relatives until either the relatives throw them out, or there's violence, or their children are abused by the relatives, and then they leave.
And the second point is about health expenditure. It's true that there is no health expenditure in the past, in the sense that you did not have public hospitals and things like this.
Yeah.
But of course, when people were sick, there were families were taking care of them.
Yeah.
So there were some health costs that were relevant, for the subsistence basket. Now, from this point of view, I'm wondering what is the effect when you compare cold countries and warm countries? Because it's true that in warm countries life is easier. The trouble is that it's much easier for all the species, including a lot of bugs, malaria, and all sorts of things. So the health cost, in the end, if half of your family has got malaria and cannot really work, and you have to provide for that, can be very, very high. And one advantage of moving to cold climates, it's that it's more difficult to survive, but sometimes it's more difficult to survive for a lot of bugs and competitors in life. So that also should be taken into account, I believe.
Right. So this, so the health issue is kind of you have to deal more with it, more than with one family, because one nuclear family, because other relatives are going to share these costs of illness basically by supporting you if you can't work.
Giovanni, do you have a question?
Yeah. I will share my comments with a long email because I have many.
Okay.
Just the one that I'm most curious about is the first constraint. When you start measuring in your linear programming things, you mentioned the first constraint is the energy requirement, and I understand that makes a difference. This initial value that you set, right, in order to come up with a number of items, the price and so forth. So why not using the way we do it nowadays, right? We take this population pyramid. And census data, population census data should be easily available for all the epochs you are playing with. Then you attach individual energy requirement for each of this. I would be surprised if you came up with this 1700 estimates, which is really, really, and so in a way you can either use it this way of measuring the minimum energy requirement as a validation thing, or you can just endogenize it and you bring in your procedure. And that solves the problem of which value to pick, because that is really the best picture of what is needed for that population in that specific period.
I agree with you. So I did this. I took the 1841 British census, and I used all these energy requirements from the WHO
and the physical activity.
And then I made up a time scale. So I said, suppose we have a carpenter,
I think I saw that.
and his wife is a spinner. And I made up an activity schedule for the whole year, and then calculated with the PARs and calculated the PLA, PL, and anyway, that came out at 2100. 2,105.
England 1841.
I used, so it's just like what you're saying.
Oh, yes.
Right. So I chose the 1700. So like the FAO has a range from 1700 to 1900, I think. So I want to say, suppose we just take the bottom of the range, and that's what I did. I mean, I think it's pretty desperate. I agree. And I think if I did it with 2100, and that's the only constraint, I'd get more quantities, but the items would be the same for all the countries, right? But they'd be a little bit higher.
Yeah, but nowadays we treat households who consume less than 5 items as outliers. That's what we do nowadays, right? If they report consuming up to 5 items, we don't believe this, even in very poor countries, and we impute.
Yeah, okay.
And in your table you had quite a few.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what happens is, like, I only get one vegetable, and everybody consumes more than one vegetable, I think. But it's government. That's an artifact of the procedure, and I think it's a way in which it doesn't match behavior. But I think this is not too important, because you can because so many different vegetables have similar prices and similar nutritional contents, so you can diversify the diet in the vegetable dimension without much implication for cost, and I think that's what's going on.
Okay, I just take an advantage to chair this session just to ask to clarify a point that probably is the main result of your paper.
Yeah.
The comparison between the estimates of the World Bank and your estimate that we have in the world 50% more poor than what World Bank believe. Could you please just few spots on this?
On the prediction, the number of poor people.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So so when I go through the 20 countries in 2011, the number of poor people, like in Africa, is not very different. Like the poverty lines I compute for Africa are not very different. So, but there's huge numbers of most everybody's poor. More than half the population is poor. When you do it for South and East Asia, the poverty lines I get are considerably higher than the World Bank lines for those countries, and so you get really substantial increases in the number of poor people. I don't remember all the figures, but I mean they go up by quite a lot.
Yeah.
And so that seems to matter. And then for rich countries, the world, on the one hand, so the World Bank says that their POVCAL calculator is not accurate for rich countries. So they don't really profess to give a number. And I looked at the data and it's too rough to deal with that part of the distribution. So I did recalculate the number of poor people using the Luxembourg Income Survey with all the individual data, and that's where my numbers come from. And they do come out with this figure, which it seems, if it's true, it seems it's not what I expected, which is something close to 2% of the US population is living below this poverty line. Now, you have to wonder whether there's some problem with the data or something then this isn't for real, except that this accords with these sort of stories about people not being able to pay their rent and living on relatives and living on the street and the other. So that's quite, that seems important. The other thing about it that comes out is that the US has the highest percentage of people living below the line. The UK is a little bit behind it, and France is considerably lower. And if France is representative of Western Europe, it may be that we see some implication of this difference between continental practice and Anglo-American welfare practice.
I think we have finished. Okay.
Very quickly, about Chicago, you have monthly prices of Chicago?
Monthly prices?
Yeah.
For
food?
In 1890.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, because I'm wondering whether it would be nice to try to compute a monthly linear programming and compare just for the seasonality issue and try to compare with the annual one.
Oh, that is interesting. Yeah, to see how people's spending would change over the year.
Yeah, I mean, if cabbages are less expensive. Okay, sorry for the...
You could do it. Okay.
Go.
No. Oh, I'm just saying you could do that. I haven't done it. It's a good idea.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's now the turn of Mauro and Jakob paper on the Great Divergence in European Real Wage Revisited.
Thank you for inviting the paper. Thanks for coming. So, on the handout, which was distributed, is on the table, it says preliminary and incomplete, and I cannot stress that hard enough, because what you're going to see today is a sample of the work we've been doing collecting data for Tuscany to make a great divergence comparison with England, and Mauro and I. And I'm going to start where Bob started. Also his lecture, which is the original, if I may say, great divergence within Europe story that I read when I was a PhD student, encouraged by the late Carl Gunnar Persson. And it's one of the papers that just got stuck in my head because it's so beautifully presented, the whole argument. You can see that wages in England in particular are much higher than they are in the south of Europe. And that's a reason, that's a motive for replacing labor with machines. And I love that. But you also know, because you saw the presentation just before me, that there are many things that you can take issue with, one of which is the basket, the composition, the prices, and so on. But that's not what we're going to do today. What we're going to take issue with today, or in this presentation, is that this whole comparison is based on day rates. So if you take a worker from England, and you take a worker from Italy, and you see how much is the money that they earned worth in terms of the goods they want to buy, they were significantly better off in England. But if you want to know per year, what were the differences? You have to multiply the day rate with the number of days that they worked. And what is done so far to keep things simple is just to say, well, they worked 250 days in England, they worked 250 days in Italy, and that was true throughout the whole period here, which covers several centuries. And the question, of course, is that true or not? And if you want to find out, you have to visit the sources on how many days per year people put in. And there's hardly any evidence. That was true when Bob made this graph. That's true today. And several of us here are still fighting with that problem. So one way forward is my joint work with Jane Humphreys, which says, look, if we want to get annual income, let's get annual income not from day work, but from annual work. And the advantage of that is you just have the annual income straight away. You don't have to worry about how many days people worked. And if you do that exercise, and you can see it here done for England, from 1250 to 1850, you have the conventional day rates multiplied by 250, and you can see this beautiful golden age of labor. And you can see this Malthusian plateau as we go into the classical years of the Industrial Revolution. That's the traditional story. If you look at annual work instead and the income from that, and it's not easy to get, I should say, that's a whole other story, but if you do that exercise, you can see it's a very different tale. There's a little bit of a golden age, yes, and then around 1650, wages start to rise, so it's like an early modern economic growth experience. And once you've done that work, you kind of think, well, what about a great divergence in annual work? Was there one or not? So what we'd like to do, and that would be eventually the contribution of the paper, is to say, well, what Bob said in his article is that there's a great divergence within Europe, 1500 to 1850. It's based on day rates in city, and it's based on the assumption that they work 250 days. What if we look at annual wages? And we have the annual wages for England now. So what Mauro and I did, we said we'll get the annual wages from Northern Italy and we'll compare those to England. And there are two differences from what Bob does. There's the difference that it's not day rate, it's annual wage. And there's the difference that this is countryside stuff, it's not city stuff. So you know that there are two reasons why we might differ. Okay, so we're going to ask, is there a great divergence in rural annual payments in Europe, looking at England and Italy? And the second contribution relates to a paper that was written about 20 years ago by Greg Clark and Van der Werf. And in this paper they said, looking at England, a pretty good case can be made that casual workers and annual workers earned roughly the same per year. And if that's true, then you can use that to infer the length of the working year. Simply by saying, you have the annual work income. If you divide by the day rate, you get a rough estimate of how many days casual workers had to put in to earn the annual income. So we do that exercise. We did it for England. We're now also going to do it for Northern Italy and ask whether there's some sort of an industrious revolution story going on, as we saw was the case in England. So that's the plan. I'm going to talk briefly about the data. So as I said, we're still collecting. I received the sort of raw data a week ago, and I turned them into the graphs that you're going to see, and they're very preliminary, as they said here. They come from farm employees that were annually employed in Tuscany. There is data from Florence, Prato, Pistoia, Pescia, Lucca, and Pisa. Most of the data, I should say, come from Florence and Prato. But you have to remember that this is not city data, this is rural areas. So it's from monastery, manorial, estate and farm accounts that these data are collected. We have at the moment 545 observations on average per decade. That's 18. That's not very much, and there are some decades that are even thinner than that. I have to say, this is why it's preliminary stuff. Be careful that it might not look in half a year from now what it looks like today. So there's that caveat. And the period is 1500 to 1930. That's the ambition. What I'm going to show you today is 1500 to 1850, and then we'll see about the rest later. Good. So what we do with the data is to use the method that Jane and I used for England. And for this you need to know the difference, the main difference between being an annual worker and being a daily worker. And the first and most obvious thing, of course, is that if you're an annual worker, you're on a long-term contract, which usually meant 1 year or more. The second thing you need to know is that they were often paid a combination of cash and kind. And the kind would be board and lodging. So they receive these non-monetary items, these privileges, that have to be valued somehow. And what we did in the English case, because these workers received food, drink, some clothing, some housing, some heating, is that we give them Bob's respectability basket. So we basically take, for the relevant years, the monetary value of one Ellen respectable basket. And we've done it for England. We've done some comparative stuff where we said, when we know the value of these items, do they compare to the value of Bob's basket? And they generally do. And I have to refer you to the paper with Jane for that argument. So we do the same exercise here. And so the implied income per year is the value of the cash plus the value of the basket, or in the cases when we have the kinds, we know what they were and we can price them, then that's added to the cash. So that's the idea. Here's the respectability basket. There's not much need to talk about that. I should say that it provides 2,500 calories for England and for Italy. This is the English one. The Italian basket is adapted to Italy. And I was going to ask, does the Italian basket have less energy? Because here in England you give 5 and then...
I don't remember.
You don't remember. But I'm pretty sure that the correction that was done by Paolo Malanima has 2 millions instead of 5 million.
Less than 5.
Yeah, it has less than 5 in any case. So I think some of the problems that we talked about here with the energy cost in different climates is taken care of already.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember now.
Yeah,
there was some thought about that.
Exactly. Yeah. That was my impression. We talked about this a minute ago. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So here are some examples for the year 1673. This is Antonio Menci. Did I say that right? Menci. Yeah, Minci.
Come on.
Oh, come on. So his cash payment was 20 Florentine lire. The value of Alan's basket is 92. The implied income for that is 112. And then we can compute the real annual income, which is 1.2. That's the idea. And the same, if we look at the worker later on, he received a higher cash payment. The value of the basket was 144, and then the total was 234, and the implied real income was 1.6. So that's the idea. Okay, and we can go straight. Yeah. Go.
Just a clarification.
Yeah.
Which kind of wages are these? As monastery farm?
Exactly. It could. I don't know. I'm not sure specifically. I should have put that up in the example. Is this from a monastery or a farm? Probably they come from a farm, a farm estate. Yeah, because there's a monastery sample, but I don't think that's covering the whole period. So this is probably from farms. Good. So let's go to the results here. I replicated Bob's graph, looking at just England, London, and northern Italy, represented by Florence and Milan. And you can see that the difference here is it's 1 unit, which means 3 baskets different in the period 18 to 1850. So that's the size of the gap at around the late industrial revolution. Okay, so let's move to, this is England, annual labor in the countryside. The thing to see here is you can see how wages are going down in the aftermath of the golden age following the Black Death, and then around 1650 they start shooting up again. And now I'm going to put in the graph also the Tuscan wages, and the Tuscan wages so far look like this. I added a trend because there's a bit of jumping up and down, but this graph would give us a number of conclusions vis-a-vis the question of the Great Divergence. The first one is that there's about half a basket difference between Italy and England, and this is how many times can you buy the basket with the income you have. It's not for a full family. I should stress that difference. So this means that in England around 1500, an average worker would earn 2 baskets, would be able to buy 2 baskets, and 1.5 in Italy. So there's slightly poorer in Italy, and that seemed to be the case going up to around 1600, 1650, and then there's a great divergence. And there's a great divergence between England and Italy, not in the classical story of the day wages, because the English wages stay flat and the Italians decline, but because the English wages increase and the Italian wages stay flat. So that's one conclusion, that they get richer in England, and in Italy it's the same. Another conclusion from the annual wages is that the great divergence starts later. It starts around 1650, and then it grows. And one of the striking things when you look at this graph, so I should say compared to Bob's, there's about 1.5 to 2 baskets different. So the gap is less around the same time, but there's still a significant gap. And when you look at the time the first, I know this from another paper that we're working on, Alessandro and I, the first steam engine was installed in 1712. And you can see that's a point where the wages are really high in England compared to Italy.
Or?
Pardon?
Is this countryside just data?
This is countryside data only.
Oh.
Yeah.
And the engine...
No, this is just to give you an idea of the timing of events. Yeah. So the engine in England at this point, which is the point where there's been a real jump in the English wages compared to the Italian wages. So you can sort of see why you would invent a thing like this. And then you have the spread of steam engines starting in the mid 18th century and really pushing on in this period where there is a large gap. So in many ways, it makes sense to say that labor in England was much more expensive in Italy, and that's why you want to replace it with machines. Okay, the second thing we can do is to compute the implied working year. So here for England we asked how many days do you have to work in casual work to earn the annual work salary. And you can see there's this Jan de Vries style industrial revolution where you start at about 150 days per year and then you gradually climb up to 350 days per year. That's the implied working year. And you also, if you mix that with the previous graph, you can see that a lot of this increase in income in England is paid for by more work, right? What about Italy? Is there like an intensification of working days? Yes, there is. So they start mildly below the English case and they stay flat up until around 1700, and then there's a really fast rise in implied working days. But it's not a Jan de Vries industrial revolution, because when they work more here, it's because it's just to keep wages stable. So it's not an industrial revolution in the sense that it's a consumer revolution, that people earn more to buy more. They earn more to basically maintain income, is what the data suggests. So a delayed industrial revolution, but not a consumer revolution in Italy. And that pretty much sums it up. So these were the two main graphs that we wanted to show you. I'm going to give you the conclusion, saying again what I just said about the graph. So the first conclusion is you have balance, a great divergence, 15 to 1850. This is day rates, this is cities. What about using annual rates in the countryside? Do we reach the same conclusion? And the answer is yes, there's a great divergence, definitely. I was very happy about it because I was worried about this day that you would be here and I would present it. There might not be a great convergence, but there is. It's a bit it's with a twist in a way. It comes later, and it's there are other differences that I'll talk about, but there is a great divergence between England and Italy. The gap was smaller in annual, when you look at annual wages, than when you look at day wages and multiply by 250, but there was a significant gap. Conclusion 2 is looking at the working year, using the methodology from Clark and van der Werf, saying you can bank out how many days workers had to work to get the annual income. And we ask, is there an industrial revolution in Italy and the freestyle? There is an industrial revolution. It began later in England, it was more steep. But unlike England, it was a way to maintain income. Whereas in England they work more and they also earn more. In Italy they work more, but they kept wages at the level they always were. Conclusion 3. So if you read the 2009 book, one of the key questions seemed to be, why was the Industrial Revolution British? The answer would be expensive labor, cheap energy, summarized briefly. Using the annual rates does not reject that hypothesis. It's still the same. It's still the case that labor is more expensive in England than northern Italy, and it's especially true in the period 1650, when the wages start to shoot up in England, up to 1850, and maybe further on. We'll have to see when we get the rest of the data put in. And when I say we have the same results, we have a great divergence, but with a twist, it's because when you look at the day rates and the 250 days assumption, you get the stagnation of wages in England, this Malthusian plateau, and in Italy you get the declining wages. And that of course creates a gap. But when we use the annual rates for Italy and England, it's the same conclusion, but here we see that England grew richer and Italy stayed flat. So in many ways it's a more intuitive explanation for English labor becoming more expensive than if you look at day rates. And on that note, how can I get back to that? Oh, I'd like to repeat my conclusion. That's funny. There should be an end slide. We'll get to the end eventually. There we go.
Thank you, Jacob. Alessandro.
So it's the second time I find myself discussing a paper by Jacob and Mauro in this room, and I think it's an interesting paper and an exciting research project. So I will just focus on some issues, but I think there is I like it and enjoy it. So to summarize, what they do is they introduce this distinction between annual wages versus day wages times 250. That was Bob's approach, and the addition is that they are really digging in new data, and it seems promising. So they found data from Tuscany covering for farm wages covering a relatively long period, and they plan to arrive to 1913 and so on. I like also to take issue on the titles of Mauro and Jacob. I think now the conventional terminology is to call Great Divergence England, China, and Little Divergence with what is happening in Europe. So maybe this could be, instead of writing the Great Divergence within Europe, I think maybe it's a bit too long and so on. My first recommendation would be, even at this stage, maybe to document in detail the coverage of the data like you have done in the paper with Jane and so on, so that we have an idea of the coverage on the time, over time, and geographical coverage and the sources. So this, because one would really like to know, for example, all these observations are coming through from one sources, two sources, many more sources, and so on. My first doubt. So the assumption that you make is really transplanted from the Humphreys and Weisdorf paper, which is to assign 205,000 calories, so one respectability basket, as a kind of the in-kind payment that these workers are receiving. I would like maybe to see some evidence supporting this assumption, because my feeling, we have done some work on Italian wages, my feeling is that these people were having difficulties to buy the bourbon basket. So the respectability is something like that and so on. It was not clear, it became clear in the presentation, the treatment of the other family members. So you go to one person and one basket, but still I think you need to address a bit the issue of how you imagine these annual workers. So they are all single workers, do they marry, what do they do? No? So this, and this could be different from Italy, from England, depending on relations of production, the specific work relations. So because I think in England you have this single man or women living with this the landlord or whatever, they have their boss and so on, and then they marry and then they find something like that. But I think this should be clarified a bit more. Then from the slide was not clear to me until you mentioned that and so on. But my main concern is that this basket could be too much. Also when I was seeing the number, because basically you have that the level of the respectability basket of the in-kind payment is higher than the wage. This is what's coming from your data. We had in the work done with Michelangelo and Giovanni, this was is the in-kind payment for daily workers that are building workers, but they have to spend sometimes on the job, so outside home. And here we get very detailed data explaining what did they receive and how they are rated. And they received, for example, on an average of 150,000 of liras per hour, the maximum they could get was 34,000 in-kind food, including rent and wine and so on. The wine actually was the most expensive stuff. So I really think you should provide or try to find some evidence of the value of these in-kind payments, so some idea and so on. Because I think it could make a difference, because it's particularly important because you are comparing level with England. So it's not just the trend and so on, then you can assume. So this is my first concern. Then I think throughout the paper, here I'm using an Italian expression, which I don't know if it translates in English, which is the stone guest. In Italian would be convitato di pietra. It's a bit Hamlet without the prince and so on. So throughout the paper you don't mention Paolo Malanima, but I think he has done some kind of I think there is also in English, is there? Stone guest, you say? No, you don't say that. No, okay.
Stone guest
English people speak out
Stone guest. No, so I discovered yesterday it is something from Pushkin and so on. So this okay, so well, basically the idea of this Italian expression is that there is the research of Paolo, which is all around your work, and I think you should, but you don't address it and you don't mention in the slide, so I think that you should invest some time in discussing it and pointing out what are the differences. What is relevant? So the first relevant point is that he has made an effort to provide estimates that alternative to Bob's, especially for Italy wages, for England wages, and he has also an issue. He has this paper about divergence and so on. So I think you should maybe check if how your result compare also to his result. And one of the modifications that he did was to just check the daily wages, so this was something like that. The second, probably more interesting point is about the Industrial Revolution. In the 2010 paper he has some implied working days and the trends. So these are days that are implied basically by his estimate of GDP and his data on real wages, and he implies he is able to extrapolate the working days in the year. And he, of course, this is a very crude approach, but he's, in the paper he spent several times defending it and mentioning that these data are actually plausible. And so you see, it's interesting. I was trying to extrapolate the point, so I'm not sure I got the numbers right. But there is a certain increase in Malanimas, but in your data is much more sharper and pronounced. So I think then we have at least one Industrial Revolution thesis, and Malanima is more willing to believe that. So I think this could be also a selling point of the paper in a sense, because your estimates of working days comes from data that are more direct in a sense. So my conclusion, so very nice research project unearthing new important data. The two preliminary findings are there is this gap, and it is in 1650-1700, and there is a delayed and necessity-driven Industrial Revolution. I would say these results are encouraging in the sense that are plausibly, they resonate with already existing accounts and interpretation. For example, even malanima, this necessity-driven malanima interpretation, even if not consistent with malanima working days, could be made consistent with at least malanima's view, which is the idea that Italy became overpopulated from 1700. About the beginning, so I think in the slides you touched the point, okay, there is this acceleration of wages in England and this can trigger this substitution. About the period of the acceleration, maybe it could be also interesting to link maybe of the literature on the decline of Italy and so on. Again, also Bob has a paper, the story of new draperies, and so this could be an interesting point. So, but that would be explaining why Italy is diverging. It's not for mechanization. It is the wage divergence that is causing Britain to mechanize, but it's also interesting to ask why real wages are growing in Britain from 1650 and so on. So I'm finished.
Okay,
Well,
thank
very
you,
nice
Alessandro.
work.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Can I?
Bob.
Yeah, okay. I was going to answer just points. Yeah, so two things came up. One was, are we giving Italian workers too much if we give them a respectability basket? And there are a couple of ways to find out, but the way I think that is best is to do what we did for England. In some cases in England, we have the value of the privileges in the sense that they received an inflated cash payment if they lived out. And we have the same cases in our data. Sometimes they receive no cash and only kind payments, and we can value those and we can compare them to when we give the basket and they have a cash pay. So there are possibilities to see how well they fit, and we'll definitely do that in the end. I did not have time to produce that today. And the second thing, where's the stone guest? Oh, he's not here. No, what we wanted to do initially was to find out how are we different from the English case when we use Bob's original data. And one next step is to go, if you go back to the slides that may I? So of the stone guest, you can see that after 1500, the day wages track quite well in the Melanima case, and in the Allen case, it's maybe here that they diverge in the period that we're not concerned with. And also, I think this graph compares Southern England to city level wages in Italy, and there's some confusion there, so we weren't ready at this point to comment on that. If you want to step in here.
If I add something, it's about the fact that Melanima, in both papers you mentioned, the GDP and the real wages have a composition effect, because we know that after 1700 data from Milan are not longer from Tuscany. So also the industrial revolution hypothesis is that it's a little bit different from what Jacob and myself are trying to show. It maybe depends because we are treating different provinces.
And the second thing was about the working year, which I didn't realize, but that's true that we have very different numbers than those that are backed out by Paolo by using the methodology that you will touch on today as well, comparing the trends in GDP and real wages. And what you're suggesting to me is that I should accept those numbers as GDP and real wages tracking each other perfectly, which is the way you back up those numbers. And you know that's not the case. So already there might be some differences. But it's a good idea to plot them up against ours to see how different they are. So I thank you very much for those proposals.
Let's keep some questions and then you can reply. Bob.
Oh, it's very interesting.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. I'm very relieved you didn't blow up everything that I said. But so one thing, well, you have some questions about some things, and one, I think it's good to be like looking at these rural workers, because that's sort of fairly standardized, and at least in England you have service contracts going later. So, but this, so one question I have though is like, what's the share of day labor and annual labor over time in both countries, right? And I think this has implications for quite a few things. One of them being this sort of your estimates of the number of days worked. Right, so this is, as you say, it's the the annual worker's annual wage divided by the day wage, right?
Yeah.
But so it's the number of days that a day worker would have to work to get the annual wage.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, we know that the annual workers are working all the time, right? Because they're annual.
I'm not going to say yes to the right, but let's assume for a moment, yeah.
But I mean, if you're employing somebody annually, presumably you're going to get a lot of work out of them as many days as you can. So my guess is they're working most of the days of the year. Like domestic servants, and these are not domestic servants, but if you had a maid in your house, she must be working like every day, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know whether farm workers. Anyway. So my presumption is they're basically working all the time. So this is then about the day laborers, right? And maybe you're either confirming or rejecting the hypothesis that their work year is increasing. But if there's only a small part of the workforce, it doesn't matter, right? And it may be shifting over time, right? If they're a large part of the workforce, then it matters a lot. But then, of course, you're hanging the story on the earnings of a small fraction of the workers. So it seems to me that this question of the relatives has to be considered.
Thank you. Can I ask just briefly to this? In England, we have quite good data, and there's always at least 50% of the workforce doing day work. And so it's up to, I think, around 1,800 in the numbers we have is that about 20% does annual work. And that's an all-time low.
Yeah, so it's higher earlier, right?
It's higher earlier, so we estimate it's about 50% before the Black Death. But so I have no idea for Italy. We'll try to find out and see how that works. So, but that's a very good point, and that's something we'd like to shed light on. But the other point is quite more important, because what you're suggesting is that if you're annually employed, they're just going to exploit you, and you're going to work the whole year round. But what we get from Greg Clark's paper is that it's pretty hard to get people into an annual contract, ask them to work the whole year, when the alternative is that they can go out and get day work, and they can work less and still earn the annual income. So he says you can't make people work more in the annual contract than they would do working the daily contract. So that's one thing. The other thing is that people change their contracts between annual and daily. So one year they would work annually, and the next year they would take daily. And there are some records explaining that farmers were annoyed because one year they had the annual, and the next year he didn't want to work annually, he wanted to work daily because that was better for him. So I think there's a lot of flexibility that might secure an equal working year for annual and daily workers. And we do discuss that in the paper with Jane, and this is also something that's going to come into the picture here clearly.
It's going to depend on the balance of the numbers of these workers, how much.
In a way, there is some equation going on in the background that we have to deal with at some point in this regard. But thanks for bringing up that point.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. Giovanni?
Okay, I have on this point basically, because as far as I understand Tuscan agriculture, annual workers were really exception. Because the point is that they were mostly sharecroppers, and annual workers basically must have, if they are speaking really not employed monasteries like part of the monastery work, but really in the state, must have been someone who has some special skill. For instance, all estates has wine production, oil production, and so people who work with the presses and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering how representative are these people. But if you want to have an idea, which I suppose is quite precise, accurate, you can go to 1861 census, because 1861 census has salariati fissi and mezzadri, sharecropper. And I think that by province, I suppose that can be representative also for a previous period, because there are not big changes in Tuscan agriculture before that. So I think that you can spot and see in each province which is the province. I bet is low, but of course the sources.
But that's a very good point, and we have to look into this and try to find out how big was the share.
Renato?
Well, my point is very simple. We speak about farm worker. You compare farm worker. Farm worker is a very generic definition for workers on the earth, because the institutional arrangement is quite different, and the historical events that characterize England and Italy are very different. So I wonder, I want to underline that you put the divergence after the half of the 17th century. Mm-hmm. It's exactly when the closure happened in England. So when the biggest change in institutional arrangement of the property of common ground. So this is not the case of in Italy where nettoyage is the method. Nettoyage in Tuscany, essentially. It's a long-running situation. Some people live on the same farm for centuries with the same family. So, according to this, I quite agree with you with the use of kind payment as an important component of the farm salary wage in Italy.
And in England as well is what people
Yes,
say.
but I had some doubt about the, for example, the respectability, because the Tuscan farmer lives nel podere. This is very different from working as a salary as in the closure system, where the most part of country of peasant go away from the common properties and go to work in the cities. So this last point, I agree that there is some coherence between my hypothesis of the divergence in the half of the 17th century and then, as usual, we do in the century, the preceding century. Especially if according to farm workers.
Yeah, so what we need to be careful, and this is why we want to collect more data, is that we get that we compare apples with apples in terms of occupations. And at the moment, the English data is dominated by servants, but we also have farm workers, and they largely trend together, the two wage sets. In the Italian case, it's basically only farm workers. There are a few servants in there, and the levels of payments to them is around what the farm employees own. So in many ways, I think we already have an apple-to-apple comparison, but more can be done here in the Italian case to collect more data to make sure that we actually
to take account of
like
different institutional context. If the institutional context, property, for example, change, this is not a small thing, because there is some external changes, some exogenous shocks which change in England the farm condition differently from Italy. This may be an important point.
This is something we need to think about, I think. Yeah. Thanks for
this is history.
Oh yeah.
There is the last question, Andrea.
It's a very brief comment following up what Alessandro was saying at the end. So it's about the divergence and the relationship between this divergence and the quality of human capital that is in both places. That you don't seem to follow up too much this into the paper, but could be an interesting avenue of research, because my point is it's clear to me, at least as a business historian, what happens in Italy is compared to UK, to Britain.
Right.
That's a difference in human capital, and it's a stagnation or regression in Italian human capital.
Okay, maybe I didn't stress that hard enough. But what we do in England and what we do in Italy is collecting information for unskilled workers, so basic labor.
Yes.
Whereas what you're referring to, in a way, I guess, is that accumulation of human capital is going to influence the skill premium, and this is not something we've gone into at all. So this is just unskilled to unskilled, basically. But thanks for bringing that.
Michelangelo?
Fabio.
Thank you. On that number of days worked per year, that 350 seems really hard to believe. They would be working on Sundays also. Perhaps this is something you should check. But behind all this, supposing that your data are perhaps slightly exaggerated, still more correct than the ones of Millennium, there is this issue. You are suggesting somehow that people worked more days when they wanted to work more days. you said they wanted to defend their yearly income. So in earlier decades, they were choosing not to work much.
Yes.
That's not easy to believe.
Well, for me it is, because from the literature background I have from England, there was this, you should think about, this is the way I think about it, in the past, what would you spend your money on other than the basic goods? You didn't go to the cinema, you didn't travel to Mallorca, so if wages are high, why work so much? And I think there's a literature that is supporting this idea, especially for the medieval period, that workers had these targets in terms of income that they tried to achieve, and if the real wage was high, they wouldn't work very much. So in many ways that's fixing the income rather than the working year. But I think the understanding nowadays is that we fix the working year, and then if income goes up, that's just good because we can buy more stuff, but not back then. So I'm trusting the data in the sense that I think the working year was quite short in the past if workers could afford it.
Alessandro.
Very coming. It was this 350 that I shared previous point, and I'm not so sure. Maybe it's a little bit smaller. I tried to take it from your graph, but I was recalling that in the paper that we have done on real wages with Michelangelo and Giovanni, we had some evidence on working days in 1870s, farm workers, and the average for Italy was 250. 251, so very close to Vasta.
Very good number. So,
I think
it is high. I should say in England, 350 days around that time was is well documented by Joachim Vasta. Really long working year. I don't know in Italy, but it's just interesting that it comes out around the same
So
range.
I think we should, but you can connect with some scattered observations.
But another point, if I may say just briefly, is that this is what they should work to earn the annual salary. Maybe they couldn't get that much days, so...
Okay, thank you to everybody.